particular, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, who's graciously agreed to launch Making Headlines. Of course, Malcolm Turnbull is no stranger to the world of books. He's the author of 3 fine volumes, The Spycatcher Trial in 1988, The Reluctant Republic in 1993 and Fighting the Republic in 1999. Arguably, from my point of view, his finest professional achievement prior to entering Parliament was his successful defence of an Australian publisher against the attempt of the British government to censor a whistleblowing author. Now, at a time when writers and their publishers are again besieged by economic fundamentalists, it's good to know that the Prime Minister is cognisant of the very real challenges facing our literary culture. I'm not going to go on, he knows of what I speak, but please join me in welcoming the Prime Minister to the microphone.
Thank you very much, Louise. I'm thrilled to be here today, particularly to launch Chris's book, but also to talk about journalism and talk about it in a room that has so many memories for me. When I was a mere boy, 20 and 21, I came to work here as a political correspondent. I had a rather eccentric collection of media outlets paying my way. One was Nation Review, one was Radio 2SM, and the other one was Channel 9. The Parliament was I think a more informal and eccentric place in those days. This was actually the Parliamentary Library. It wasn't often frequented, and I found it a very quiet place to do a lot of my work, particularly preparing for my law examinations and essays, because I was supposed to be at the law school, which is just down the road. So this has got a lot of memories, and I want to say this about Chris Mitchell before I go on to my speech. What comes out of every page of Chris's book, which will annoy many pages, which will annoy people, irritate people, so forth. That's what controversial books do. But what comes out of it is a real love and a passion for newspapers. This is a guy who loved every minute of his professional life as a journalist. He loved newspapers, he loved the feel of them, he loved the work they do, the leadership they showed. He's an impassioned editor. And that's at a time when the industry is under challenge, as Louise identified, it's worth bearing that in mind. That passion is of great value. So, in Making Headlines, Chris has delivered a crisp, plain English account of the dynamics of politics and the media in Australia. He takes us through some very cogent analysis of many of the big political developments across the past 2 or 3 decades: the Republic referendum, the war in Iraq, the struggle against violent extremism, our national struggle to address Indigenous disadvantage, the challenge of balancing budgets, global response to climate change, the phenomenon of Hansonism, and the spectacular implosion of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years. Now, I don't want to be accused of being a spoil sport, but I may have to plead guilty to that. I'm not going to get into some of the very frank assessments of a number of my predecessors. I'll leave that to others. It's better that it's Chris Mitchell who's making the headlines today, not me, so this will be an uncontroversial speech. I do that because I want to reflect on another very important aspect to the book, and it's the focus Chris brings to the challenges facing modern media in the internet age and the imperatives for the media industry, particularly newspaper companies, if they're to secure a strong and successful future. Now, given his experience for a decade or more at the helm of one of the nation's most prestigious newspapers, his views are very much worth heeding. Chris came to newspapers at the age of 17, turning down a dentistry scholarship to accept a cadetship on the Brisbane afternoon daily, The Telegraph. He left his job at the peak of the industry at the very premature age of 60. I can't imagine why he did that. Seems far too young to step down from a big job. That very much suggests a lifelong labour of love. Now, as many of you may know, I was very nearly lured down the same path. When I was a kid, and I was in England about around 1975, I first made the acquaintance of Harold Evans, the legendary editor of the Sunday Times, who I might say I bumped into in New York only a week or so ago with his wife Tina Brown, as energetic and as fit and dynamic and interested in the affairs of the world, and about to walk across town at the age of 88. So it was fantastic to catch up with Harry. Anyway, Harry was a great inspiration to journalists at the time because of the insight team, the investigative journalism the Sunday Times had. And he'd heard me give a speech at a university debate in England. It actually sent a note around to this young journalist. Just imagine yourself at 20 or 21, I guess, and the note from Harold Evans, editor of the Sunday Times, please call on me in the Gray's Inn Road tomorrow. I mean, it was like getting a summons from God. It was extraordinary. Anyway, I went round there, and he encouraged me to have a lifetime career as a journalist. And he said, I told him I was studying law. He told me I should drop my legal studies immediately. He said, if you persevere with them, I see former Chief Justice Spiegelman there. He said, if you persevere with them, you'll be bored out of your wits. You could end up becoming a judge. And he shuddered. And then he shuddered again, and he said, or worse still, you could become a politician. Well, at least I've avoided the bench. But anyway, the journalism, the years of journalism, the great heydays of journalism, are being remoulded with technology. Chris writes bluntly about the challenges and the failings of his own industry. He offers some very keen insights into the impact of digital disruption on the newspaper industry. The proliferation of new internet media platforms, particularly for advertising, has begun to strip much of the value out of the lucrative revenue streams of display and classified advertising. It's not so long ago we used to talk about classified advertising, particularly the Fairfax broadsheets, as rivers of gold. Well, those rivers of gold are not flowing anymore, and that has affected the whole industry, and it is a massive disruptive challenge. The frustrating thing for journalists, and I see so many of you here today, the frustrating thing for you is that there are more people reading your copy than ever before. You are reaching more eyeballs than ever before or ever could have been conceived possible, and yet the revenue is not there in the way it was. Chris notes in his book, anyone watching news consumers on a train to and from work in London, New York or Sydney cannot fail to notice how rare it is to see a newspaper today. Reading on smartphones is ubiquitous, and it absolutely is. I noticed someone's trying to get people to chat to each other on the tube in London. Good luck getting them out of their smartphones. He takes us through the range of responses from the established media industry, including the great debate over paywalls. Some publishers started giving away their best content, afraid of appearing like dinosaurs if they didn't. And Chris writes, it took Rupert Murdoch to stand up in 2009 and say enough was enough. Good journalism is expensive and people need to pay for it. This struggle for survival, as Chris also notes, may be never-ending. The fight for the future of newspapers carries implications for how the affairs of our nation are reported, how people inform themselves in a democracy, and how our society reflects on itself. In the noisy, frenetic world of internet media, where barriers to entry have never been so low and competition so intense, how can media outlets continue to invest in the quality journalism so vital to democracy? Chris writes of the importance of the quality and uniqueness of content as the way to differentiate a newspaper and its websites in the digital mass media. People will pay for news and commentary and analysis, he contends, and I'm sure he's right, if they cannot get it anywhere else. Now, we worry also about the trends towards an industry too often prey to shallow analysis, a blurring of ethical standards, and focus on the ephemeral rather than the substantive. And again, Chris talks about this, about the frenzy and the fury of the echo chamber of Twitter, for example. At the recent UN Leaders Summit in New York that I attended, there was a lot of discussion of what has been called post-truth politics, the phenomenon of politicians relying on claims that sound right but simply aren't true. There's a big feature in The Economist a few weeks ago called The Art of the Lie, which pulled a lot of these issues together. As you know, there's always been this phenomenon of politicians drawing very long bows and saying, exaggerating, saying things that are untrue. I'm not suggesting there's anything new there. But what we're starting to see is, and you see it, I believe we saw it in the last election with the so-called Medi-scare, you're seeing it increasingly in other places in the world, where the range of political discourse has become so disconnected from reality, and even though the media calls it out, the politicians have the ability to access consumers directly in a manner that reinforces their prejudices. You know, we've gone from a world in which the media was curated. And if you think about it, newspapers always, while you'd have in some very big markets like London, you'd have newspapers that had clear ideological lines. Generally, in most markets, newspapers and, of course, broadcasters had to play it down the middle, not necessarily because they wanted to be fair and balanced, or they always asserted they did, but because they had to appeal to a broad range of customers. And that's otherwise you couldn't get the advertising base. But increasingly, as we move into a world where narrowcasting is possible, and this, of course, began with cable television, and the internet has absolutely supercharged that, we run the risk that everybody, in effect, gets the news service that they want, that confirms their prejudices, confirms their disposition, rather than challenging it to a balanced analysis. Now, this is an issue that we are grappling with. As usual, technology has moved ahead of our ability to understand it and indeed reimagine a civil and a balanced discourse that is going to lead us to the right policy outcomes. I believe that the Fourth Estate has a very privileged role in our democracy. You've heard me say this again and again, that the work that journalists and editors do is just as important in maintaining our democracy as the work that members of Parliament or ministers do, or prime ministers do, or judges do. It is absolutely critical. Without the commitment to truth, fairness and accuracy, we won't get the intelligent, well-informed, rational public policy discourse Australians are entitled to expect. And it's getting harder to get that across, harder than ever before. Now, having been on both sides of the media, I have a deep and enduring respect for the role that newspapers play and that journalists play and the media plays. I just conclude by saying that I'm deeply touched actually, by the passion that you show, Chris, in this. You're a tough guy, and you've always represented yourself as being a tough guy, and you should be as an editor, strong leader. But you also have a very big heart and a great love for this industry. I remember as a young man being so entranced by it, just the noise and the vibration of the presses in a big newspaper, the excitement of late-breaking news, all of the eccentrics that fill every newsroom, of course, not at the Australian, of course, I'm sure. It's unique in the world. It is a wonderful romantic business. It's under great challenge, but a great newspaper today, under Paul's leadership, forging ahead on foundations built by many others, including Paul Kelly. He's here today. Built by many others, but led by Chris Mitchell at a critical time in our nation's history, led with great insight, great intellectual ability, but also a great love and a great passion for the industry, for the institutions, and above all, the people that make them happen. So I'm delighted to be here, and I hope your book does very well and does not disappoint the publisher, because she makes her authors feel very guilty if you don't recover the advance immensely. So well done and good luck. Good luck to this book and to its salesmanship, headed by Louise. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister, for the generous remarks and for your close reading of Making Headlines. I'm not sure how many of your political colleagues understand the media industry and the challenges it faces as well as you do. Your appreciation of both the challenges of the business model and the craft of journalism are greatly appreciated. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. Well, as Chris Mitchell's book explains, the relationship between politicians and the media is complex and, I now understand, frequently fraught. I'm not the first to describe it as a codependent relationship, which is rarely unequivocally happy. Reading the manuscript of Making Headlines reminded me of that great cartoonist Patrick Cook's observation, if you lie down with dogs, you get up with hair between your teeth. Takes a while for people to get the joke. I will leave it to you to decide who the dog is in that dynamic. I've had a professional relationship, thank you Chris for understanding the joke. I've had a professional relationship with Chris Mitchell since MUP embarked on the process of publishing the Latham Diaries in 2005. That best-selling book heralded MUP's focus on contemporary politics. We were looking for a media partner. One might have assumed that Fairfax was the natural partner for such a publishing event, so it was a pleasant surprise to have our assumptions confounded by a superbly professional proposal from News Limited, led by Chris, that enjoined all the mastheads in the group in the project. I won't dwell here on the hair-raising business of publishing Mark Latham or his diaries, but suffice to say Chris was a fabulous ally in the process. I would also like to acknowledge the assistance of Bruce Loudon, who's here today. Bruce was the colleague tasked with managing the nuts and bolts of the deal, and he did it brilliantly. So MUP has worked with News Limited and The Australian in particular ever since 2005. And what always has struck me is how supportive Chris Mitchell as Editor-in-Chief has been to his staff, as MUP has gleefully plucked many of his most talented journalists out of their day jobs to write books for us. Chris has actively encouraged his journalists to take time to write books, and that's not a universally held position among media executives. So we owe him our gratitude for lending us Paul Kelly, Chip LeGrand, Peter Van Onselen and Brad Norrington, to name just a few of the terrific journalists we've been privileged to publish. I must admit to a particular interest in the insider's account, so when it became clear that Chris Mitchell might be retiring, we did discuss the idea of a memoir. After all, his editorship of the Courier Mail and then the Australian were important in the recent history of the print media, but it was his leadership of those papers that occurred during this incredibly tumultuous period in politics that was particularly interesting. I think Rupert's having a bit of a say here, so let's pop this up. This is what we do. There you go. Now you know how books stand in bookshops. So it was particularly important to us that we have his account of this tumultuous period in politics. We were delighted then that Chris agreed to publish with MUP, and we were certainly taken aback when he refused any advance whatsoever, Prime Minister. Until our dealings with Chris, Tony Abbott could lay claim to the title of our least venal author, but Chris has now taken over that place on MUP's honour board. MUP prides itself on offering our authors a genuine and rigorous editorial engagement. But how are we going to tell an editor of over 2 decades, perhaps, that this might be better expressed in this way, or that that section should be moved elsewhere, or even, God forbid, that maybe the full and frank account of an encounter might be best left unsaid? We did give Chris our best advice. He did listen politely, and then he wrote the book he wanted to write, which is what every author does in the end. I hope that his wife Kathy won't mind if I mention that we did at moments lose our way every now and then between marriages, but Chris didn't love my suggestion that perhaps the Mitchell wives, forgive me Kathy, with all due respect, could be listed as wife number 1, wife number 2, wife number 3, and then I lost count. But seriously, Chris, you've been terrific to work with, and if you even indulged us by appearing on many more ABC programs than you might have wished to. For that, we are very grateful. And now you're beginning to understand the challenges confronted by the book industry as we go about selling your book. Thank you for your vote of confidence in MUP, for bringing your book to us, and I do look forward to working on Volume 2. Please join me in welcoming Chris Mitchell to the microphone.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister, for taking the time to read my book, for giving me feedback about the book weeks before the book was released, and for being here today. Thank you to everyone else for coming, but especially to my friend and former editor, Clive Matheson, for helping to secure this venue and for all his help with editing of the book. Special thanks to my publisher, Louise, for her kind words, and to the team from MUP. They've made the process simple and quick. I'm also eternally grateful to Joe Aston and Bryce Corbett for the publicity they've given Making Headlines, And I know Louise is chuffed that the Fin Review has done so much to keep the book in the headlines, and we have a daily email exchange about the latest AFR piece. I trust, given both Joe and Bryce are independent always, as Fairfax says, they'll soon get to Rupert Murdoch's comments about Greg Highwood and the bottom of the toilet. We also are indebted to my long-term friends Paul Whittaker, the Editor-in-Chief of The Australian, his weekend editor Michelle Gunn, media editor Darren Davidson for running extracts from the book and for backing it with marketing. I'm grateful to all my family members and friends here today, but especially to my wife Kathy and to my son Jake. I made a terrible mistake this morning. I said Kathy looked very smart, which apparently I should have said gorgeous. So you're gorgeous. She wasn't wearing a tracksuit. I'm thrilled so many of my family and journalists have made the trip from interstate to be here. I'm also grateful to the brilliant staff at The Australian who've made life such a pleasure for me the last decades. I'm aware how much I owe the Murdoch family for opportunities they've given me. Despite the sniping from enemies across the industry, most grown-ups are aware the book is full of praise for Rupert and his kids. Is Alistair McLeod here? Alistair was going to come, so... I'm also grateful to another former boss of mine, Peter Tonner, head of Foxtel, for coming today, and to John and Damien Eales, the sons of my former primary school maths teacher. Jack Eales was one of the most influential men in my early life and taught me the 2 years after my father died. Some of you will know that that was December 21, 1964, the very same day my friend Kate McGregor's dad also died. We try to mark the occasion each year by email, phone call or lunch, and I'm aware of Kate's and grateful for Kate for the support for the book. So how to describe making headlines? A book somewhat framed by my enemies up to today, but I think the PM addressed some of that. To me, Caroline Overington actually did it best on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. She wrote, and I quote, "It's pervy, it's amusing, above all, it's a passionate love letter to journalism." That tweet captured exactly what I wanted the book to be, and I'm pleased to say many of you here today who have read it have responded to me directly in similar terms. I'm not by nature a bitter man, nor is the book bitter. But in my retirement, my memories of my career are my own to retell as I see fit. And for some of the mushrooms in modern journalism who seem to misunderstand the nature of insider reporting, I recommend the ultimate insider's book, Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker, about his time in the financial markets. I also think there are healthy former editor memoirs. Malcolm mentioned Harry Evans, also Harry's wife Tina Brown wrote a terrific memoir. Another former Sunday Times editor, Andrew Neil, did, and the Herald Sun editor, Bruce Guthrie, did a few years ago, our former magazine editor. In politics, there's also the diaries of Mark Latham, as Louise said, and Bob Carr, or the memoirs of Julia Gillard, Wayne Swan and Tony Blair. As my friend Peter Fray said in The Australian a fortnight ago, there is a long history of kiss and tell books in the media, many serialised by this company. Now, if someone wants to make a big deal about a funny tale of a former PM pushing his way into my house on a Sunday afternoon, guzzling copious amounts of red wine without bringing a drop of his own, and then blurting out a story about seconds rugby and Joe hockey, which he then sees as an intimate betrayal when it is retold after hockey has left politics and the former PM has lost his job, I can only say two things in my defence as a journalist and former editor. I hacked no phones. I did, however, actually type out some text messages with Gina Rushton. So I also took no money from any match-fixing brothel owners, and I can swear to that. What I did try to do was well summarised by Nikki Sava. I have tried, after leaving journalism, to show readers what their political leaders are really like and how relations between government and the media work. I remind people the subjects of my hopefully entertaining tittle-tattle were not Amanda Mead or David Marr or Andrew Bolt. They were 5 Prime Ministers and Rupert Murdoch. I did not kick down or kiss up. It should be clear to anyone with a modicum of sense that 3 of the PMs wasted too much time on media spin and 2 succeeded because they managed to achieve big reforms in the national interest. I hope Mr Turnbull, who in my experience did not play the media game in the way of his three predecessors, can reach back to the great reform era to put an end to the nonsense of politics these past 9 years. If more people read Paul Kelly than Twitter, that might be possible, but I fear modern media is losing its mission statement. Anyway, I had fun writing Making Headlines and reflecting on what a privilege it was to edit papers for nearly a quarter of a century. I thank News Corp for that privilege. Most of all, I thank my friends in journalism, which I regard as one of the most important professions of all, along with politics and the law, in any functioning democracy. Thank you.